Hello.
Hello, Tony. You all right?
I'm good, thank you.
It was coming up with various things saying that I couldn't allow access to various things. When I've given you access before, so I was getting perplexed by Zoom. But yes, one of my early discussion ran over, so my apologies. But ready and waiting now.
I thought I'd been stood up, Peter. It's absolutely no problem. No problem.
Never. I was just timing it right, so it was 11:11 when I was joining in. So it was what I like to think.
So thank you ever so much for joining me. You're Peter Collins, Museum Director at the Staffordshire Regiment Museum. Can you hear me okay? Peter?
That's correct. Yeah.
I think there's a little bit of interference there. So we're talking a little bit today about trenches and specifically during the First World War. We know the First World War is synonymous with trench warfare, and I think that's where it kind of reached its zenith in terms of how it was deployed, etc. Could you describe a little bit about what conditions were like in the trenches, how widely they were used by both the British side, the French side, and the German side, please?
Originally, at the start of the First World War, we had a few initial battles, a little bit of cavalry battles went across the lands, but very quickly from September, October 1914, the troops started to embed themselves down on both sides. So the Allies obviously being the British and the French predominantly at the start of the war, and the Central Powers being Austria, Hungary, and Germany bedding themselves in. So we set up these trenches, which were in theory, they were temporary, as all trenches are intended to be. So trenches obviously have been around for a long time in warfare. You know, if you think of the people outside the gates of Troy, they probably embedded themselves into trenches to escape from being thrown spears at, and that's because it's logical to encase ourselves in the ground. But the original intention was these were always temporary structures. So that sort of formed quite a bit of what they were like in terms of their conditions. So you had originally, obviously, there's forward trenches, which is the trench that probably people are quite familiar with, the ones that sort of they're going over the top, you know, hopefully back in time for tea and medals if they're thinking of Blackadder and that sort of thing. And then behind those, though, are things like communication trenches and supply trenches. So there's a whole network, and there was a whole network across France and Germany where they were developed with supplies coming up, troops going up and down. So the troops were there usually probably 4 or 5 days before at the front line. So in terms of that forward trench, and then it'd be back down the line. So they weren't there for a very long period of time. But if you imagine the noise, and of course what we're not doing is the smells, the conditions in those trenches you're referring to about soldiers were covered in lice generally. They were obviously, we know about mud because the First War was quite synonymous with mud, but also, of course, it did dry up. It didn't rain all the time. So once it's caked in, you also had the problem of dust around a lot. Soldiers were very difficult to keep themselves clean in that role. And of course, eating food, I think that would be quite a challenge. And of course, food would bring in other animals. So things like rats were quite prevalent in trenches as well. So some people have their own cats to protect from the rats, very so to speak. Probably there's a whole poem in there, I think, of other things that were brought in. But also what you have is, of course, unpleasant conditions. So sometimes people who have been lost within no man's land, they would you'd find bodies within trenches. Sleep conditions were very poor. So the officers would have had a dugout. They might have had a bunk beds and those sort of things, so away almost from the actual front trench. But for a lot of soldiers, they slept where they stood, or they would sleep in what they call funk holes, which are little holes cut into the side of trenches and things. So they were condition-wise, they became, so initially as a temporary structures. Probably everyone thought they weren't going to be there for very long, and they were very useful. But of course, it became very, very well developed. As the war goes on, of course, as the trench systems become the entrenched part of that war on the Western Front, then we get quite used to it. The trenches, of course, we often associate just with the Western Front, but of course, they're used extensively, and the same conditions apply on the Eastern Front and in places like Italy, Austria-Hungary, and those are places as well. So troops embedding themselves in was quite readily in that sense.
I think that one of the reasons you had this stalemate on the Western Front was because previous to beginning of the 20th century, food was always a problem, wasn't it? Keeping the armies at the front line fed, but you had the tinned meats, bully beef, and all that, which meant that essentially you could keep armies there for a very long period of time because of these new inventions that happened because of the industrialization. You had barbed wire, you had mass munitions, and you had tin food that would sustain an army indefinitely in those positions.
That's right. That supply lines were extensive to support that army as they went over through the top. And you're right, the trench warfare side did help that. And in terms of that industrialization of war as well, in terms of planning, it's not a guerrilla war as you might have seen if any listeners are aware of, say, the Peninsular War in Napoleonic Wars, or later if you think of things like the campaign in Burma in the Second World War, which is guerrilla warfare, where sort of short skirmish. But this was total industrial war, and those troops could be fed, they could be supported. Arms, of course, could be supplied up the lines. Particularly the Western Front would stretch right back to the coast. So those feeding, and also for when troops cut your finger, they sort of patch you up and say, "Off you go, mate, you're back to front." If you had had more serious injury, they would assess you and then be able to get you back down the lines and on a boat back to England, if it was in terms of the Allies, within a very short time period. Very similar to what we would have now, if we think of people in Afghanistan, and that's the thing. But the difference, they're not on a boat; they're flown out very quickly. So.
How did they break the stalemate? What inventions, what techniques did they develop to break the stalemate of trench warfare, specifically on the Western Front?
So specifically in the Western Front, we were quite from about 1915, when they start realizing that this trench warfare is starting to get embedded. We start looking for what they would classify as war-winning weapons, as they would like to refer to them. So what things can break that stalemate? So you have obviously the use of big guns and specific types of shells that can actually break through things like barbed wire, and those not very effectively, I'll point out. And the use of big artillery to before they would do their operations, they would have something called they would do a barrage, which is a whole volley of artillery fire. Both sides would do this sort of technique, and then we developed something in the Allies side called a creeping barrage as well. So they would go forward, and in front of them, shells would be filling. So that again would take out those trenches, and they would have a quick run across no man's land, take the trenches, and off they go. Again, not very effective. And of course, sometimes people actually ended up using friendly fire, so actually blowing up their own troops, which isn't very effective. But in the early days, in terms of the one of the first ideas they have is, particularly in the German side, is the use of gas as one of their weapons to do chemical warfare, as we refer to it now. Not very effective, really, but the use of gas was quite scary. And of course, people probably be aware from the Second World War, obviously, gas was considered a real trauma that was going to happen. Thankfully, didn't in that sense. But gas had a slight drawback in that it was based on the effectiveness was based on prevailing wind. So you deployed your gas, which was lovely, and the wind was blowing in the direction you wanted to go. Unfortunately, wind being the temperamental beast that it is, would then turn and change direction. So of course that gas could then blow back over your own troops and enemies, which were quite ineffective. Also, if you get towards the 1917, which is one of the biggest war-winning weapons, would have been what was originally referred to as land ships, but the tank. So the British developed tanks within Britain. So the first use of those, the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, and that was quite an effective weapon. Although they did some of get stuck, broke down, and got a bit traumatizing. Certainly, the first effect of the Battle of Cambrai really shocked the German troops in how they would be used. And gradually, as the war developed, they actually became an effective tool of the Allied offensive. Germany never really had any tanks of much effect, but Germany also had what were referred to as zeppelins, so airships. So they actually took that war to, a bit familiar from people who are aware of the Second World War, to the home front. So they actually, which I would find a bit strange now to almost be finding, they used to call it the Zeppelin menace, which I find a bit strange to be scared of an airship, pottering along at but quite a short mile an hour. It doesn't really seem that menacing. A bit H.G. Wellsy maybe, but the use of them on bombing on mainland Britain did help bring the war to the home front and help scare people as well, which is what they were effectively doing. So lose that morale on the home front. Intriguingly, actually, towards the end of the war, the Germans actually developed an aircraft called by a company called Pole, which is a big triplane aircraft. It's an aircraft with 3 wings, basically one on top of each other, like a biplane, but with an extra wing on top, to actually drop a bomb on New York, which they thought would so scare the Americans that they would fall out of the war effort and Germany might win, because obviously the Americans came in towards the end of the First World War. Thankfully, they didn't get to make it. And intriguingly, if you think of the sort of how people are using these weapons and things, the Atlantic actually hadn't been crossed by aircraft at this point. So, so Alcock and Brown's first flight, across the Atlantic non-stop was not till 1919. So it was quite a challenge almost that they were trying to cross the Atlantic using this war-winning weapon. So there was lots of ideas to break that stalemate, and obviously there was the use of surging troops, which we're familiar with, from Afghanistan and Iraq in recent years, about the surge of troops. But largely that was quite ineffective. Tactics, though, also changed throughout the course of the war. So people learn how to negotiate these texts. So the popular images of the again using a bit of Blackadderism, but the generals behind the lines, and Colonel Melchett and all that sort of thing. And there were probably some of the ineffective generals in the First War, but a lot of generals and planners changed their mindsets and changed their ideas of how to win this one. For instance, obviously at the Staffordshire Regiment Museum, our Staffordshire Regiment helped take the Hindenburg Line in September 1918, which is a fortified trench line through effective planning. So they again using air power. So obviously planes are quite quickly used to deploy. So originally scouting and then change into those bombing tactics as well as the airships. So they start using those barrages and the tactics really change. So by the time of that, the 1918 we really are learning how to use these new weapons effectively.
You do see the First World War as a watershed moment in terms of what we consider modern day warfare of incorporating tanks and planes. Air superiority was really just emerging at that point. I mean, you had the Royal Air Corps, which was the forerunner of the RAF, and that was just about coming into being, during the First World War. And you had the generals who were probably used to cavalry charges, understanding and learning that this new warfare would need something else. And like you say, an evolution of their tactics to kind of combat the different obstacles like the trenches, the barbed wire, mustard gas. They had to think in there to develop their ideas of how to beat the.
They did, and a lot of those, although some of those techniques had been around before, so use of trenches, use of barbed wire, for instance, the Boer War, use things like submarines, the U-boat menace, for instance, in the First War. Submarines had been around in the American Civil War in the 1860s, but they hadn't been done to the scale that we see in the First War. So as you said, that is the watershed moment, and we've never, although the Second World War was much bigger in terms of the amount of bombing and use of soldiers and techniques, and of course loss of life, unfortunately, than the First World War. The First War really does act, as you rightly said, in that watershed moment. Things were never the same, and we learned as well, of course, the tactics that Hitler used quite effectively in the 1930s in taking Poland, Czechoslovakia. The Blitzkrieg tactics were fulfilling all those ideas that sort of almost coming out of the First World War. Fuller, who had been wrote the definitive books on the First World War, who was a British chap, he actually advocated the tactics that became Blitzkrieg as a response to his understanding of the First World War.
It's this idea of total war, isn't it? That the war isn't just fought on the battlefield; it's also the enemy's capacity to manufacturing munitions. And also, like you said about the zeppelin menace, it's about the psychological effects of warfare on the population, their appetite there for the conflict. It was just as important.
You're right to refer to, actually, there's a good phrase that Roosevelt uses in the Second World War to apply to what America is doing before they joined actually the Second World War, but he calls America the arsenal of democracy. And it is true that you have to produce more ammunition, more weapons, and more equipment and soldiers than the opposition. That is a war of attrition in that sense. Although in historiography, sometimes people refer to the Napoleonic Wars as one of our first total wars, because the war happened. We were fighting battles in the Americas, in the India, in Europe. It's not on the scale to what we see, and everything is geared, to that war effort. Its climax is really with the Second World War, where the British economy was totally geared to war, and everything was produced for that war. And we see that, but even down in that in the First World War, for instance, things started to get restricted. So rationing came in because a lot of our foodstuffs, just like in the Second World War, came from abroad, from our then empire, and those sort of things. So again, you could take out a country by knocking off their food supply, and that's things. So winning that war on the home front was as important as winning the war on that battlefront. So Germany, for instance, Hitler used a phrase later called "they were stabbed in the back by their politicians." But Germany, because what happens in the 11th, 1918, is a ceasefire. It's an armistice. It's not the defeat of Germany. They give up because they're losing that war on that home front.
It's a good point, isn't it? Because the way the Germans saw it, they were still on French soil when the armistice was signed. It wasn't they I suppose didn't think that they were losing the war. They thought
they did not know.
Because I know that outside of it, the British were blockading the supplies of food to Germany. So you had the Bolshevik Revolution going on in 1917, and I know very much the German aristocracy, the German higher class were very much aware of what could happen in Germany, what happened in Russia, happening in Germany. So I think there was a lot going on outside of just what was happening on the battlefield on the Western Front, and that kind of played.
That's quite right. Yeah, that's quite right to refer to it, and I think it's there was a real fear, which is of that Bolshevik Revolution, obviously taking out Germany in terms of losing that war, and there's a big fear in the Allied powers as well with that, which happened in Germany. But although when we think of for back to Napoleonic Wars, there is obviously the Battle of Trafalgar, which gave us naval superiority, the British and across the Empire, and so although the naval side wasn't used extensively, apart from sort of maybe the Battle of Jutland in the First World War, which was a bit inconclusive really. The blockades that we did of Germany lost that war for them on that home front. People in Germany were starving. Although things were hard in Britain, people were not starving. There wasn't literally enough food. There's talk of cannibalism and those sort of things in Germany that towards the end of the First World War and things. So they were really up against it in terms of that, and that war is on all fronts. It's not, and as you say, not just on the battlefield. It's across that home front, and you have to win the war at home as well as winning the war on the battlefield.
Yeah, Peter, it's been great talking to you. I know we've only touched on a very deep, complicated subject, but I think it's fascinating hearing about how the evolution of the industrial age culminated, like you say, in the trench warfare. So people have been learning these skills in, like say, the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, mechanizing weapons, etc. And like you say, they reach their zenith in terms of their potency, and that's partly what led to the trench warfare that we read about. And like you say, Blackadder makes documents in the Blackadder series. It is a fascinating subject. Thank you ever so much for talking to me. It's been fascinating. And you do actually have a museum, don't you, with a mock-up of a trench system at the...
We do, yes. We have as well as a little displays in our cases about in the museum about trench, we have a whole trench system not as extensive as they were on the front, I should mention. We've got one here that people can access and go inside. You've got noises and sounds to get a little bit of a sense of what it's like. I will point out, though, it is cleaner and less muddy, and no rats and things like that. And also, if people are interested, by the way, if they go on the Imperial War Museum's website, for instance, the whole of the Western Front, certainly in terms of trenches, were actually photographed from the air, and they're all available on their website, which are quite fascinating to see. You can see the extent of how these trenches went on, and of course continue. Yeah, they're still there in some parts in the. People are still digging up ordnance in which is what we call shells and bullets in Western Germany, and on the Italian-Austrian border. They're still digging up bombs and things from the First World War. So we certainly threw a lot at them. So,
but it's absolutely fascinating. Well, thank you very much for talking to me, Peter.
It's a pleasure, Tony, and speak to you soon.
Take care.